What is going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. Marvel Snap has felt remarkably good for the last week, and I think a big part of that is that while this remains, to me, the best deck in the game, it has dropped off in play rate in a noticeable amount, and this drop-off in play rate has allowed other decks to really start to thrive and threaten the mid-range space that, if people were playing a tournament, would most likely be dominated by Shou-Lao. This is something that I'm frankly quite grateful for, because it allows me to play a lot more weird and off-meta decks than I otherwise would. I still suspect that Shou-Lao is the best choice if all you care about is wholly amoral victories, but there are a lot of other decks that are perfectly competent and fill a similar role. This specific Shou-Lao list is a very combo-oriented one, and by virtue of that, it's almost become more of the part of the combo sector of the metagame than it is part of the mid-range sector. It's a deck that all the mid-range decks understand what it's trying to do, and when it does what it does, they're gonna retreat, and being relegated to being just a combo deck is actually kind of an upgrade for the metagame. Now that we're finally able to understand Shou-Lao as a combo deck, retreat properly against it as if it is a combo deck, well, there's a lot of other things that are actually trying to interact with your opponent in a mid-rangey kind of way. This is still a very skill-testing deck, too, choosing which direction you're going to go. Are you going to play to beat your opponent by only a couple points, but be less vulnerable to tech? Are you going to play to create a Voltron of Omega Sentinels and Scarlet Spiders, but be more vulnerable to things like Cosmic Ghost Rider and Red Guardian? The push-pull here depends on your matchups and requires a lot from you in terms of knowing what you're playing against and the possible pieces of interaction they could have. So if we accept Shou-Lao as mostly a combo deck, what does it look like to be a mid-range deck that is trying to beat Shou-Lao as a combo deck? Well, it looks a lot like this V-Hand list from Sizer, which is built to do a couple of things specifically. You'll notice the Stardust. That is to force Shou-Lao gamers to a game plan that does not involve creating a bunch of Scarlet Spiders. When they are not on the Scarlet Spider game plan, your Gambit plan is much more effective. This means that you go back to being a deck that actually beats up on Shou-Lao. One of the big upsides of being a Scarlet Spider Jocasta version of that deck was that it made the quote-unquote counter in Gambit a little bit harder. Now, this deck has adapted by countering the counter, and I think that that adaptation is enough to move this deck significantly further up the tier list. Stardust is also hitting some other things that are pretty important, like Doom 2099, which is otherwise a pretty awful matchup if you're being faced with a wide variety of Doom bots and you have to try to outpoint all of them. And of course, it hits Star-Lord into Arnim Zola. Not necessarily as perfect of a tech card as a Cosmo, but hitting all three of the matchups you kind of want to hit in some very specific ways, and especially being good against the matchups Gambit isn't good against, that is a meaningful upgrade here. Now, there is one flex slot here that is, of course, Scarlet Witch or Lin Li. Scarlet Witch is a card that has come on in recent months as Star-Lord has taken over the combo metagame. Magic decks have arrived as a method of countering Star-Lord. Obviously, Scarlet Witch, one of the single best cards in the game against any deck that really feels that they should be able to have a turn 7. They shouldn't. They're not allowed to do that, and you have to stop them. But if you care more about going tall, I think it is very viable to go for the Lin Li plan as well. Part of the reason that we are less pressed about going tall in this deck is because we are taking back control of some of those matchups where Gambit isn't particularly good. So if we make him good in some of those matchups, or we are just able to prevent them from going over the top of us, we are able then to create a deck that has a lot more game into otherwise prohibitively bad matchups that we needed the stats from Lin Li to beat. I've had this list on and off the tier list for a couple of weeks now. It's a list Derek built a little bit ago and basically has been playing for a while and telling me the entire time that he thinks the metagame is fake because nobody else is really adapting to it and playing things like this. And since Tucker did a video on it, this deck has started to really spike in popularity, which is notable because it sort of proves Derek right about his thesis. Like, there are plenty of things that you can do about a metagame that looks the way this does. This is a deck that is notably particularly powerful into a Star-Lord list. Now, there are a bunch of interactive things that make this deck a bit of a skill test. There are going to be like specific reads you're going to have to make in specific matchups, but Professor X is phenomenally powerful at preventing your opponents from doing anything ridiculous with their Star-Lord and their output. And as long as you can set up your lanes such that you don't immediately get got by Fin Fang Fooms, you're probably going to be in a pretty good spot when you can play a Professor X and then win another lane. This has been a part of Marvel Snap's general method of playing. Like, there have been Professor X and then win another lane decks about as long as there's been Marvel Snap, and that is very much still alive here despite multiple nerfs to Professor X and the things that win other lanes. The real reason you do this, though, is that the Batroc stuff is particularly powerful. Professor X can protect you from Gambit while also getting in on Star-Lord, and it's particularly interesting to mess up certain lanes that your opponents are using to try to combo off. I still prefer this baseline prio list of Supergiants that I've been playing basically since they changed the cards that allowed this to actually function. It's just a very solid list, but there are a million good Supergiant lists. As always, the key thing to understand about Supergiant and its position in the metagame is that it is functionally an old school control deck. This is a sister or brother, sibling, however you want to phrase it, to those old school Shang-Chi, Enchantress, Zabu decks. That's really the vibe that this deck is trying to replicate, and it manages to replicate it through a couple of different things, mostly the disruption that Supergiant creates, combined with the combination of Cosmo and Negasonic. The idea is that as Marvel Snap gets more combo-centric, it becomes a lot easier to beat a combo deck by pulling the pin out of whatever tower they're building. They're playing Jenga effectively, and your job is to just pull the right one, and I guess in Jenga, your goal isn't to topple the tower, but in Marvel Snap it is. And Supergiant is the deck that allows you to do that. Doom 2099 remains, in my opinion, the easiest method of climbing ranks in Marvel Snap. It's a very, very solid list with a lot of cube equity wrapped up in either aggressive early snaps when you know you're doing your thing, or aggressive, I guess aggressive, snaps on your 5 costs disrupting your opponent's game plan. Now, these 5 costs are particularly useful, like for example, Cosmic Ghost Rider, perhaps the most wide-ranging tech card in the metagame, can do all sorts of stuff from preventing a Star-Lord Arnim Zola from working, to turning off a Jocasta lane, to hitting an Iska the Unbeaten before it can get out of control. Lots of things that this card does are particularly important to the type of deck this is, because this is the type of deck that if the interaction it plays does not pull the pin on opposing combo decks, you will lose, because you are very much limited in terms of output to being a fair Marvel Snap deck. So you need cards that prevent unfair decks from being unfair. You will lose to Wong combos. You will lose to all sorts of stuff if you do not have Cosmic Ghost Rider, if you are not packing a way to deal with that kind of stuff. Of course, Sandman playing second fiddle here, but is notably solid because he does match with the same type of game plan. You want to stop your opponents from doing things that combine their cards in ways that are superior in terms of point output to what you do. So you stop them from doing that by making it harder for them to play cards. Shou-Lao? No sir. A bunch of cards coming down on the final turn out of a V-hand deck? Look, that Quinjet? It's not doing anything. You were going to play 5 cards, now you're playing 2 or 3. I know it doesn't seem like a particularly meaningful thing, but it does mean a lot. As always, I do want to get Legion in here. I think Legion is a very solid addition to that coterie of 5-cost snap conditions, but I just don't think the deck can afford it. I realize Star-Lord is a bit of a meta boogeyman at this point, but I do think that a lot of it is down to how he plays and not particularly him being all that amazing. Not that this deck is that bad, but the reactions that I see to him are out of line with how good it actually is. That said, it is still a very potent list. It's just a victim of its own predictability and to some degree a victim of its own success. A lot of things are going to have random options to just beat your snap condition, which is a bad thing for a deck whose snap conditions are as predictable as this one. I'm not saying it's hitting Mr. Negative levels. I still think it's significantly better than Mr. Negative as a combo deck, but a lot of that is down to how much it locks in those games when it actually does combo off. The big thing that Star-Lord has going for it is that it is very close to genuinely unbeatable when it pulls off the combo, and I think that is the major driver behind the bad feelings this deck generates, is that it is very, very close, closer than any other combo deck ever really gets to being an actual unlosable game as long as you just do the right stuff that turns off your opponent's stuff. The quality of answers this deck has in the form of Alioth and Juggernaut, and I know this is going to surprise people to hear me describe it as an answer, but Fin Fang Foom is kind of an answer. This is a high answer quality deck that has a nut draw comparable to Mr. Negative, but it's just way more guaranteed. Mr. Negative is doing a lot of points, and sometimes it draws wrong. This is a deck that is just going to have access to the cards. They don't need to be flipped or anything. The energy cheat is more guaranteed, and the fact that they're going to turn off your cards is also more guaranteed. The cards you played fuel their output, and then the cards you try to play don't have text. It's a very powerful endgame that is the fundamental crux of what makes Star-Lord so good and what makes Star-Lord so hated. The way to beat this deck is to prevent that from happening. There are basically no good options when you are staying into a Star-Lord on the final turn of the game after they've gotten a bunch of energy. The options to beat this deck all happen earlier. And I think that also benefits this deck to some degree, because it means that to some degree, people will be making mistakes in your favor. It's a cube positive thing if people stay against you, because they were supposed to beat you on turn 4 by playing a super giant, on turn 5 by blowing up your Star-Lord or Cosmoing that lane, and if they stay after letting that happen, that's on them. And I think that that is notable. This is a deck that is a factory of not only unfortunate and unfun turn 6s, but a lot of retreats that don't actually lead to turn 6s. You stop them from comboing off, they leave. They combo off, you leave. It's like the most anti-turn 6 deck in the entire game. And I think that's another big part of why it has the reputation it does, despite being, in my opinion, more pretty good than totally busted. I think this is a good example of why the all-in combo Star-Lord deck isn't as good as people think it is, because when you look at this deck, as long as it has priority, if they go for a Star-Lord combo, you can Red Guardian the Star-Lord or you can Shang-Chi the Star-Lord. Both of them work. They snap going for the combo, and they instantly lose. Like, this is what I mean when I talk about beating Star-Lord tends to be on the turns before turn 6. By the time you get to 6, not worth it. But any Supergiant deck just prevents them from comboing off. A deck like this will be able to blow up the Star-Lord or prevent it from being doubled most of the time. And that just sort of generally means that you have decent matchups into a bunch of stuff. I played this deck, and I gotta be honest with you, I didn't know if it would be able to maintain like a successful level of actual metagame play, but before I filmed this video, I checked on Untapped, and in the top 50% of Infinite, there are 410 games played of this deck with a 57% win rate. And I know I got some comments on this last time. People were like, you're just still playing Star-Lord. And it's like, yeah, but I don't really think this is what you mean when you complain about Star-Lord. This is notably not a deck that really cares too much about Star-Lord. It's just like, I would like to get to Star-Lord and then get 2 energy out of it so I can play a Hulk and a Polaris on the final turn of the game. Much more the vibe here. Not like he's bad or anything, but this is not the deck that is doing the things that I think people hate about the card. That said, I did do a video on it, so if you want a further breakdown, like a full 15-minute thing, you can check that out. At the top end of Infinite, there is a bounce one trick named Doc Guapo, and he's basically been playing the same list on and off since Shou-Lao came out. It's just a very straightforward bounce Shou-Lao list, and it is a very, very powerful thing to be doing. This is a really reasonable deck in a world where you are trying to beat up on mid-range decks. The thing this deck does particularly well is beat up on decks that have relatively predictable play patterns and relatively predictable point output. The thing this deck does not do particularly well is beat up on combo decks that are able to go over the top of it. It makes it a pretty classic thing. There is, and always has been, a dynamic in Marvel Snap of the less teched out mid-range decks doing better into the very teched out mid-range decks because their tech cards aren't particularly relevant in the matchup, and you have devoted more of your slots to actual point output. However, the downside of that is because you are not playing the tech, you end up with worse matchups against combo decks. And whether or not it's a correct decision for you to play a deck like this will depend a lot on what the metagame is and what your read on it is. But it is undoubtedly successful in its niche. Another deck I just did a video on, the Afflictra list, is a take on Aurora that is looking to infuse as much power into the relatively more interactive mid-rangey version of Aurora as opposed to the wholly point output based version that plays Doom 2099. This is a deck that is based entirely around making Aurora do what she does on the final turn of the game and supplementing that with as many powerful cards that stop your opponent from doing things as possible. In the conversation we had about tech versus no tech in mid-range decks, this is definitely one that is trying to stop your opponent from comboing over the top of it. Whether that be the notably bugged Spider-Ham or Cosmo, you are trying to stop them from messing with you. That said, it does mean that you get a little bit big brothered by the decks that are doing very similar things. Like Doom 2099, for example, is kind of an awkward situation for you to run into because they get to be the deck that isn't playing a 3-3. You're playing a Cosmo, they're playing a 3-8 or whatever. They're playing a 311, it's Caliban. Like, that's sort of the mismatch that you run into, and it's a pretty classic Marvel Snap dynamic. This is a deck that is choosing to pack some interaction and hopefully using it effectively on the final turn of the game thanks to Anti-Venom. But it does get like a legitimate point upgrade here. The Anti-Venom Mysterio stuff is particularly notable because it lets you play Luke Cage with Mysterio. That gives you effectively a 210, and it can even get bigger depending on the buffs you want to put on it. You could try playing things like Ascani Sun instead of Herbie, or if you're worried about Limbo, you can play a Scarlet Witch in that spot. There's room to mess around with this deck, and I think that's really the strength of the Aurora archetype, is that whatever combo decks you're worried about going over the top of you, you can customize some of these slots to have cards that are good against them. I've been a bit down on ramp recently, largely because Doom 2099 has sort of evolved into a deck, especially with the addition of Iska, that tends to be able to just generally do more points than the ramp deck is able to do, and because this metagame has become a little bit more useful to have decks that are not just playing one card on the final turn of the game. It's become a little bit more about being able to do multiple things in that way. You saw this with the Aurora deck we just talked about. It's basically playing Anti-Venom specifically so it doesn't just have to play Aurora on the final turn of the game, because being predictable is very bad. And this is a deck that is notably predictable. But what's making it a little bit better recently is, I mean, you saw what we talked about early in the video. There's a little more Stardust running around. And if there's a little more Stardust running around, the differences between this and Doom 2099 become pretty notable, because this is the same kind of deck. A lot of it is about the early curve, a lot of it is about hitting your specific things, and a lot of it is about your fives being disruptive. And if those fives are good, you're winning. And that's basically the way I play this deck. Like, my snap condition overwhelmingly is I have a Legion, I have a Cosmic Ghost Rider. It's really good in the context of the game. And just being able to do that, it's quite a reasonable thing to be doing in the current age. It's hard to figure out exactly which graveyard-based combo deck to put on here at any given time. Like, I'm putting the Phoenix Force one on here because it is my preferred version of graveyard-based combo, but this could easily be the Firehair Star-Lord deck, or maybe the Galactus deck that is trying to revive it with 12 power off of an Adamantium infusion. There's a lot of graveyard-based combo things you can do, and I really feel like I only have room for one, and this is kind of my favorite one because it gets to do things that aren't just graveyard-based combo. Like, you can win games just by putting a Spider on a multiple man after you played like an Iron Fist, not an Iron Fist, he's not in this deck, but like a Nico that moves it, or then you play a Ghost Spider or whatever. You could just put some points on the board and do stuff, and then Alioth people, and it's like, oh man, I remember when I was able to do this. It's a reasonable deck. There's really nothing bad I have to say about this. It's really just a sort of placeholder, though, for all of the various graveyard-based combo decks that you could be playing. And I mean, as long as we're talking about, like, we lose to Stardust, right? Like, as long as we're in losing to Stardust Alley here, which is definitely where we are, we might as well talk a little bit about Hela. I mean, this is a perfectly reasonable deck. I think it is a very solid attempt at trying to make Hela relevant. I believe Denish is actually moved off of the Alioth because it has been less helpful. Supergiant has been a particularly helpful thing to do. We're really still in the world where this is a deck that has a combo-ish output, but the problem you run into is basically, A, Stardust exists in greater numbers than I would suspect it did a couple of weeks ago. B, outside of Stardust, you do not combo higher than a Star-Lord. So you're a combo deck that has to play tech for other combo decks. And to be clear, I actually think that the Supergiant stuff is pretty good here. Like, it is pretty good here. But Hela is just not a deck that is good at doing this. And so the fact that it has to warp itself and contort itself to make itself fit into this metagame, where previously, whenever Hela was good, it's because the meta came to it. Because the metagame was this very mid-rangey, sludgy, techy thing, and Hela doesn't care about any of that. But now we're in a metagame that's very different, and the metagame is not coming to Hela in the same way. You know me. I love putting the mid in mid-range, and this is definitely a list that puts the mid in mid-range. I don't know if it's a Sizer list or a Chamo list, but it's based on basically the same principles as the V-Hand list here, which is to say, I think we'll be able to outpower stuff and out-interact stuff as long as we have a Stardust to make sure that we're not getting a billion spiders dropped on our heads. This is a very specific reaction to A, Shoucasta, and B, Doom 2099. And then against other combo decks, a lot of them are going to be vulnerable to the ability to reposition a Cosmo. Nice Star-Lord, buddy. I don't think it's happening. And so you also mix this, a powerful interactive package, with a bunch of really strong cards. Notably, the one thing I think is really holding this deck back is that the V-Hand deck is just a really good Gambit deck. It is very difficult to play a matchup against the deck that can blow up roughly everything you play. It is really unpleasant to play that matchup. It is not good because they are close to as good at doing points as you are, and you don't have anything in the entire world that can stop them from doing that Gambit stuff. It is just painful. I think Arishem is a really good example of how cards sort of earn a reputation and then coast on that reputation. Arishem is not a very good deck. It's fine. Like, it's just a totally fine thing to do if you want to, like, have a fun experience and you find Arishem engaging and rewarding, but I don't think this deck has been actively good in an extremely long time. It's been months. And I think there are a couple of reasons for the delta between how people feel about it and how it actually is. And I could draw some parallels with Star-Lord or even something like Loki, who still kind of gets hate despite being absolutely terrible. Like, there's just kind of a lot of residual bad feelings wrapped up in this that I think prevents people from understanding what Arishem actually is. There's something Binks said, and I think this is a very astute observation. It's an observation I very much agree with, but I want to shout Binks out here because I think he was the first person I saw really like codify this. You don't play against Arishem exactly. You play against the general shape of Arishem. Arishem does a bunch of different stuff, but it mostly looks similar game to game. Over a long enough sample size of playing against Arishem, you'll kind of understand what the vibe is. And I know it sounds a little bit ridiculous, but that matters because fundamentally what this deck is a deck that is built on being inconsistent and is trying to leverage just good stats and tech despite its inconsistency. It's not Arishem's fault, but just good stats and tech doesn't cut it anymore. You've got to be great stats and tech. Arishem was fine at doing this when people weren't playing Aurora decks that were just as tech heavy, less inconsistent, so more consistent. Don't know why I phrased it that way. Double negative is bad. Just like in Marvel Snap, a double negative is bad. You don't want to play Mr. Negative twice. They actually just go back to where they were originally going. I do not have ADHD. I am absolutely going to get right back on topic. The point is, the points in tech decks, like you look at the points in tech decks, you could call Doom 2099 a points in tech deck. You could call Aurora a points in tech deck. You call any of the Batroc decks points in tech decks. They're way stronger than Arishem at doing this, and they do it more often. It's tough. It's tough out there for an Arishem gamer. I don't know what they'd have to do to get me to play Null in my Destroy deck again. I think he's just forever dead to me. Like, I don't know what he could possibly ever do to earn his spot back. I love playing Shou-Lao in this deck so much. I genuinely, like, it's the deck I am the most married to Shou-Lao in, because, like, let's say they nerf other Shou-Lao decks, like they nerf Shou-Lao based on those other decks, and it's like, oh, we made Shou-Lao worse. Well, that deck might not exist anymore, but this deck, I'm still gonna want to play Shou-Lao. That's just how much I value being able to actually go into multiple lanes on the final turn of the game. It's how much I value not being an idiot 6 cost the way Null is. It's such a valuable thing. I don't know if I can ever go back. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal. Remember to like and subscribe, and let me know what you thought about this video specifically. I've been doing a lot of work on trying to be sort of more intentional with my communication, and I hope that really came across with this breakdown. So, you know, enjoy, and I will see you in the next one.